Hi, I'm Federico Genoese-Zerbi. I'm the General Manager for ab initio operations in Southern Europe, and I'm also a data governance practitioner. I've been working on data governance since 2003. What I want to talk about a little bit is the evolution of data governance's purpose, what it's being used for, and what types of companies need data governance and why. And I want to start by talking about the genesis of data governance, how it first came to the fore. And data governance was really born around 2002, 2003 in the United States, where regulators of a number of large banking monolines, credit card companies, focused on the credit models that these companies were using to issue credit and to actually drive their business. And the rationale was very simple. The regulators were concerned that if these companies did not manage their data assets correctly and their whole business viability was predicated on the effectiveness of these credit models that they were using the data for, then these companies could fail. And by failing, they would have an outsized impact on the US economy. So the first projects of data governance, the first initiatives around data governance started with these companies subject to regulatory scrutiny. And they focused on really documenting their data assets, creating metadata that described glossaries, described the reports, and then ultimately governed the models that they were using for their business. So this was the first wave of data governance. It was very manual intensive. It required the work of data stewards to really document these glossaries, these reports, and these different assets. And it really put these initial companies as pioneers of this data governance revolution. And then what really followed was a very significant historical event, which was the financial meltdown of 2007, 2008. The housing bubble in the United States popped, and global financial instruments became very, very stressed because of liquidity problems, because of a number of structural factors that at the end of the day really had to do with knowing about risk and knowing about liquidity and having the right control over the data that describes this risk at the world's largest financial services companies. And all these events and the whole meltdown led to a number of really major regulations that were imposed on these large financial services companies, including the Basel III framework and the BCBS 239 principles, all of these that were applied to large banks. And a large component of this was around data governance. And it was a slightly different focus on data governance than what had occurred in 2002, 2003 with the US credit card monolines, because all of a sudden data quality became really important. And one of the dimensions of data quality that was really important was data timeliness. It was obvious during the meltdown that the availability of timely liquidity data had been a fundamental problem for financial services companies. And so this measure was really important. Where the data came from, how it was processed, how it was built, everything that we now associate with the idea of lineage, both business lineage and technical lineage, became important. And regulators started to look at both of these components and expecting banks to be able to justify and describe how their data was created. And because of these factors, the metadata that described the data governance at this stage was no longer purely manual. It was no longer created by hand by the data stewards, but it was created through automated means, code scanners, data quality controls that ran on the existing data and generated this metadata that described it. However, even in this case, even though the metadata was created in an automated way, it was created after the fact, after the data had already been created. Now, it's important to note that as data governance was important to regulators in financial services, in around 2015, other industries subject to regulation were also asked to implement data governance policies, processes, and programs. And two that were very significantly impacted were the telecommunications industry, again, subject to a lot of regulation with a lot of data having to do with customers, with call detail records, and all sorts of other things that are important to their business. but also the airline industry and the flight industry. And regulators were very keen that data be available in order to improve safety of flight. And there was a very important incident in 2014 that was one of the triggers to this focus. And that was the fact that a Malaysia Airlines airplane was lost. And for a very long time, people had no idea what happened to it, in part because of missing data systems that would have allowed tracking of that plane and finding that plane. And the same reasoning regarding safety of flight was applied to cockpit video recorders and flight log data and other things that are used by regulators to ensure safety of flight. So all regulators across multiple industries were really focused on data governance, data quality, and documenting the data and ensuring that data was reliable. Then there was a very interesting phenomenon, which was the big data phenomenon. And this created the idea that data was not just used for critical business processes, but could be used for any process. And companies could become data-driven. They could use predictive models to figure out what was going to happen in the future, whether it was consumer behavior or industry directions. And they could use these predictive models to improve their business outcomes. But this whole idea of being data-driven, everything being all data all the time, really required vast amounts of data, and the data had to be understood, fit for purpose, and utilized. This was the big data revolution that occurred around 2016. Everybody was talking about it. Now, this raised the importance of data governance, not just because regulators were pushing for it, but really because it was fundamental to the success of the company. You can't be a data-driven enterprise unless your data is truly fit for purpose. You can be sure it's correct, and then you can ensure that the predictive models that you're betting your company on are going to make the right predictions. And that has been really an important shift in data governance, and it has led to data governance focus becoming more critical in enterprises. It has led to a higher profile of the chief data officer within enterprises having a seat at the table to really drive data governance discipline across all departments and really improving the fitness for purpose of data. But even in the view of this new wave, the focus of metadata was about documenting, about describing after the fact what the data is. And this is where, starting around 2021, there has been a shift where data governance is not just about documentation, but it's about data itself. And this is driven by a number of factors, but perhaps the easiest one is eliminating errors and reducing complexity. So as cloud migrations accelerated across the industry, as the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning is becoming ubiquitous, the complexity of documenting all the data is daunting, and the errors that can be associated with that documentation continue to grow, and the potential for these errors is huge. And that can have a significant impact on essential enterprise processes and functions that rely on the data. As a result of this, what we're seeing is a shift in how data governance is being rolled out in various industries. It is no longer just documenting what data you have, but it's more using your business processes and the definition of your business processes that actually underlie everything that you do in an enterprise that generate the data and generate the data governance. So instead of relying on a developer to document what data that developer has created, or to document the control on that data and implement it and ensure and trust that he or she has done so correctly. It's more about using the business definitions, the business terms, to auto-generate the controls, the descriptions, the data itself, and the pipelines so that there is complete congruence between the business processes, the data, and the data is governed. And it's not governed because somebody after the fact described it, but it's governed because from the beginning, from the very beginning and by design, it has been built in order to be in a governed state.